Let us pray. Let's raise up before God today our nation as we prepare to celebrate our 56th year of independence and our first year as a republic. Loving Father, you are the King of kings and the Lord of rulers. You bless all the rulers and their peoples who honor you and serve you. Bless our nation, Father. Today we pray for our nation and for all who live in it. Give all the rulers and authorities your knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Help them to fear you and honor your name. Let them also render justice to our people. Let your righteousness fill our nation. Let all the forces of darkness and derision and destruction be destroyed. Let there be peace and prosperity in our nation. We also pray for the people of our nation. Bless the efforts of their hands. Let our nation overflow with milk and honey. Let our barns be full. Let our young people sing and dance in full contentment. Let your joy rule our hearts. Let your peace rule our nation. Let your justice fill our nation. Let your righteousness control our lives. Shower your blessings on every one of us in this nation today and forever. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Amen. Together we say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forever. Amen. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President. Announcements by Your Honor, the President.
I receive an excuse of absence from Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers, Senator Tate, Senator Drakes, and Senator the Most Honourable Mr. Walcott.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sin of the Senate and moved by minister, introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I am commanded to give notice of the following resolutions. A resolution to rescind the initial resolution passed by the Honourable the House of Assembly on the 23rd day of June 2015, specifically on the matter of the Rotary Club of Barbados approval of a lease for Rotary Club of Barbados South for a per parcel of land, the property of the Crown at the Garfield Sobers complex. And the second resolution is for the approval in accordance with Section 5 of the State Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Cap 225, the leasing to the Rotary Inclusive Play Trust, a charity registered as Charity 910 under the Charities Act, of a parcel of land, the property of the state at Garfield Sobers complex, Upton, in the parish of Christchurch, for the purpose of construction and development of a children's facility, a recreational facility for children with disabilities.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 2, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Civil Aviation Bill 2022.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I seek the permission of the Honourable the Senate to treat orders number 2 and number 3 as a cognate debate. The two of them are actually quite linked, and I would wish to seek the permission of the President to have a cognate debate on items on the order paper at 2 and 3.
The question is that we treat items number 2 and 3 as a cognate debate. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Bidding is the ayes have it. Proceed, Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise on this occasion with perhaps a sense of occasion on the passage, on the introduction of these 3 bills. Mr. President, order number 2 is the order establishing, the resolution establishing the legislation for the creation of a civil aviation authority. And order number 3 speaks to subsidiary legislation under that umbrella legislative body, Mr. President, and that speaks to, in this instance, the creation of the Air Navigation Services and Air Investigation Services Unit. Now, Mr. President, Barbados for the last 30 years has functioned under the authority of an entity known as the Barbados Civil Aviation Authority Department. Barbados Civil Aviation Department. It is a department which falls under the umbrella of the Ministry with responsibility for international transport. And under that umbrella, Mr. President, that department treats to and regulates air traffic in and out of the country. Every aircraft that we see flying from the north coast along our south coast and landing at the Grantley Adams International Airport, hereinafter I will refer to as the aerodrome, is regulated by the Civil Aviation Authority. Every aircraft, Mr. President, that takes off from the Grantley Adams International Airport is regulated by the Civil Aviation Department. Now, there are a number of agencies that typically people do not see under the umbrella of the Civil Aviation Department, and I want to refer to what some of those agencies are. The Civil Aviation Department, which I just spoke to, manages and has been responsible for air traffic in and out of the country. Everything that happens in our airspace has been regulated by the Civil Aviation Department. Air traffic controllers Mr. President, who communicate with pilots, air traffic controllers, Mr. President, who deal with our air information navigation system, and air traffic controllers that interact with other civil aviation authorities throughout the region, in particular in Trinidad and Tobago, PRCO, which has an oversight mechanism for our upper airspace. All of those things have been historically regulated under the Barbados Civil Aviation Department. In addition, Mr. President, you also have an entity known as the Air Transport Licensing Authority. Every aircraft that is able to fly in or out of Barbados that operates under what we call either Fifth Freedom Rights or Seventh Freedom Rights is licensed under the Air Transport Licensing Authority. Now, many times when people see the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport, they see visitor arrivals or they see aircraft at the airport, but I used to call the international transport section almost the stepchild of the ministry, because it is very often the entity that is not seen. And under the international transport, as it relates specifically to aviation management, the agencies to which I just referred, the BCAD and the Air Transport Licensing Authority, have an integral role to play in managing our air traffic systems. Now, Mr. President, I say all of that to put into context the fact that the Barbados Civil Aviation Department has been functioning outside of the provisions that are typically required at a best practice international level for international civil aviation. Now, much of what we do nationally is connected to what is required internationally. An aircraft flies from Barbados to St. Lucia, an aircraft flies from Barbados to London on a long haul trip, or an aircraft flies from here to Miami on a short haul trip. Those things are governed not by national regulations independently. One country meets the standard, another country doesn't meet the standard. One country works in a particular way, another country works in a different way. An aircraft flying from country to country is regulated largely under the provisions of an entity known as the International Civil Aviation Authority. It is headquartered in Montreal, Canada. And under the ICAO, which is what I will organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. And ICAO, headquartered in Montreal, Canada, has responsibility for ensuring that international standards are, one, attained and then met. Now, Barbados found itself in an uncomfortable position over many years, where when I joined the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport in July of 2020, you have briefings when you join ministries, and the public officials prepare comprehensive briefs on all of the areas that you need to be aware of. And I remember vividly the brief that was presented to me at the time, and it said Barbados was due for an ICAO audit in 2019. And the recommendation from the Barbados Civil Aviation Department at the time was that Barbados should defer having an audit done in 2019 because Barbados had not been successful since 2016 and before in meeting all of the requirements for the audit. It was felt at the time in 2019 that there was a considerable body of work that needed to be done for Barbados to find itself in full compliance with the requirements for ICAO in order to meet the requirements and pass the audit. Now, the audit requirements are not set at a threshold for 50%. Who wants to have a 50% chance or 1 in 2 chance of meeting all of the requirements for an international aircraft, for an international flight? The threshold for the ICAO standards governed by these are the Chicago Convention standards, and they govern in a series of annexes what countries are required. The threshold, Mr. President, is 80%. A pass rate of 80%. It was felt in 2019, Mr. President, that Barbados needed to do a comprehensive reform of its aviation system in order to ensure that we could meet the requirements of the audit. Now, I'm sure that in a different incarnation in 2019, also in international transport, from a different perspective at the time, we had an IMO audit, International Maritime Organization audit, where on the maritime side, Barbados also had a rating that says we were not where we needed to be. In fact, in that instance, because the audit was not deferred, Barbados failed at the time, and we were not able to successfully meet the threshold prior to 2018 at the time. On that basis, Mr. President, a comprehensive body of work was undertaken from the maritime side for our maritime transport to meet the requirements of the IMO, and a comprehensive body of work was undertaken to meet our requirements for aviation. And so we have maritime transportation and aviation transportation all under the umbrella of international transport being treated to in a holistic and a comprehensive way to ensure that Barbados was positioned to meet the top available international standards. Now, ICAO has a membership of around 193 countries. The standards are outlined. There are a number of critical elements which are required of us, 8 critical elements in particular, and we are required to meet all of them. So what did the government of Barbados do? In 2019, Mr. President, having made that assessment, the government of Barbados undertook first and foremost to transition the entity to which I have earlier referred as the Barbados Civil Aviation Department into a civil aviation authority. That comprehensive reform process is what we are now culminating with here today in 2022. And I am very proud to have had the opportunity over the course of 2020 up to 2022 to have piloted that process of reform to the stage where we can now prepare to pass that legislation. Mr. President, in January of 2021, we brought in a series of consultants who would work with their specialist expertise, who had worked across the region and with ICAO on the establishment of similar entities for civil aviation. We have had 3 dedicated consultants working with Barbados over the last 2 years for the purpose of helping us to navigate the development of this authority and the drafting of this legislation. We're very appreciative also of the support of ICAO. ICAO then, once we had a draft of the legislation, ICAO not only flew down their Vice President for the Americas, with whom I had the opportunity to meet and to assess how Barbados would be in a state of readiness, given the imminence of this legislation, and then what we would need in addition to be able to implement it. And I want to spend my time today in my presentation, Mr. President, speaking about what we need to be able to do to implement this legislation. Now, when we speak, Mr. President, about the importance of the legislation in the first instance and what it is required to do, it requires follow-up action. Now, Mr. President, the Civil Aviation Department, was required to do a range of things. But there were some things, Mr. President, that I want to point out that it was unable to do because it was not necessarily set up in a way that was allowing it to be able to implement these things. Some of the issues that were identified in the audit included these things: the absence of resources and sufficient aviation activity, thereby limiting the ability to establish sufficiently qualified personnel. In other words, Mr. President, if you have a medical doctor who does not have a day-to-day practice in his or her chosen discipline, and therefore they have not been in a position to build up the required level of expertise simply by repetition, seeing a range of cases, different scenarios, and then building up the ability to treat to different situations and different scenarios based on experience, then you have a capacity constraint. There were a number of operating regulations, Mr. President, that were not in place or were not aligned with ICAO standards. Those regulations are now incorporated in the draft that we have here. There was the absence of an appropriate system for certification and continuous surveillance of aircraft operators and a resolution of safety concerns. Mr. President, one of the consultants that we brought on board in January of 2021 was specifically for the purpose of dealing with the question of aviation safety. We have had an aviation safety expert working with Barbados on a day-to-day basis here over the last 2 years. There was also the absence of the assurance that air transport operations were conducted then in compliance with the ICAO standards that I have made mention of in terms of the various critical elements. And a number of these things we will speak about in a minute. There are also 6 areas that I want to raise that we had deficiencies in, that we had to isolate support for. Certification of air operators, aerodromes, aviation training organizations, and aircraft maintenance organizations. Now, Mr. President, your mechanic working on your car is not your mechanic working on your aircraft. The engineer who is used to working with chemicals is not your engineer who is working on your aircraft safety. There are very different disciplines, and so Barbados needed to build the capacity to ensure that we had the capacity to support management of aircraft operations here on the ground and so on. Now, I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, Mr. President, I was traveling, and I'm sure many of us have had these experiences. I was on board the aircraft. We had boarded the aircraft. The aircraft had a slight delay at the gate. Before the aircraft taxied from the gate, the captain came on the PA system and he said, "We're having a bit of a difficulty closing the cargo hold." So we called for the engineers. And as soon as we can get that resolved, we expect in about 5 minutes, we'll be on our way. With about 15 minutes, we were on our way, Mr. President. And then we taxied down the runway, and it was in the dead of the night. It was 12 o'clock in the night or so. And we taxied down the runway. And then typically when you're on an international airport, you're usually on a queue, waiting to take off. So there are planes ahead of you. But there was nothing on the runway, Mr. President. Not a single plane besides us in front of us. So when the pilot pulled over to what I could at best describe in layman's terms as the shoulder of the runway. You know, when you're on the highway, you have the car brake, and you pull over on the shoulder, the pilot pulled over. I said, okay, this is not a good sign, something is wrong. The plane parked there, it was there for a few minutes, and a few minutes more, and then a few minutes more, then you heard that sound, ding, ding. And you knew that that was the pilot, the cabin calling the flight attendants, the cabin crew. I said, oh dear, something is wrong. Cabin crew got up. You're still parked on the shoulder of the runway, and next you know, you hear that familiar sound, click, click, seatbelt on buckling. Cabin crew gets up and hustles to the back of the plane, goes back, hustles again. No one says anything. You're in this plane, but no one says a word. Then the plane starts to move again, and the pilot is chipping. But you know there's a process that you know you're accustomed to know. The plane comes to a stop, and then it picks up momentum, and then it goes and it's ready to take off. It wasn't doing that. It was just at a brisk chip. I said, something is wrong. This plane is going back to the gate. And so said, so done. Plane went right back to the gate. When I saw the aerodrome ahead, the airport ahead of me again, I said, okay, we're going back to the gate. But we weren't going to the gate, Mr. President. We went to an apron on the side. And the pilot stopped. He says, ladies and gentlemen, I guess you can see that we're not taking off at this moment. We've returned to the gate, but we don't have a gate. We seem to have a problem. And he said those magic words. He said, we seem to have a challenge, and it would not be safe for us to take off at this time. I was like, okay, problems now. So we sat. He pulled over, and he said, we are going to call the ground engineers. We're on the phone to the ground engineers, and we're calling in our engineers as well. And there were 2 ladies who were sitting over on the other side, and they said, well, safety first. They were quite comfortable to stay behind, and so everybody else said, safety first, and so we waited. But the confidence, Mr. President, that I had, that notwithstanding the fact that I was about to be airborne momentarily on a plane, and I wanted to make sure that safety genuinely came first, was supported by the fact that there were engineers on the ground who were skilled and competent and capable of resolving whatever the issue was before that plane became airborne. Quickly, they came, they brought the stairs, because they didn't even take us back to the air bridge. They took us to the gate, they brought the stairs, and the engineers hustled and came on board the plane. They powered down the plane, they did what they had to do, and then they came and they said, Mr. President, we're sorry, but we need to do some tests. And regrettably, I know it's not the news you want to hear, but we're going to have to disembark all of the passengers, and you'll have to take all of your belongings with you. So we had to get off the plane, they had to bus us back to the terminal, and we went into the terminal. Within about 2 hours or so, whatever the issue was had clearly been resolved, and they announced and they said, flight whatever is now ready for boarding, and everybody hustled to get back on the bus, to get back to the plane. But we boarded the plane in the confidence, Mr. President, that the engineers who had been on the ground were adequately trained and adequately certified to have resolved whatever those issues were, so that by that time the plane hit the air, we were all safe, and the pilot was confident that it was now safe to take off, whereas it had not been before. A side story, Mr. President, is that the flight was supposed to take 2 hours. We were going from Spain to London, and the flight was supposed to take 2 hours. I swear that plane got there in about 1 hour and 15 minutes. I'm telling you. But having said it was not safe to take off, and having had the engineers working on the ground, every time that plane shuddered in the air, I said, okay, I'm holding on to my armrest. But it was really just the pilot breaking his speed limit because he was trying to make back up time and get to Gatwick. So that's the kind of confidence that we want to be able to give to our international traveling public when they're moving from one location into the next, that there are skilled professionals on the ground in whatever jurisdiction capable of resolving efficiently and safely any and all issues relating to an aircraft. Especially, Mr. President, in an era where every single airline carrier will tell you that they do not have spare aircraft right now. When we talk about COVID, when we talk about what happened during the pandemic, Mr. President, what happened during the pandemic didn't just happen to some sectors and not others. The international transport was one of the most badly affected sectors globally. Airlines will tell you that production of aircraft slowed down, and so they are now awaiting the delivery of new aircraft. Airlines will tell you that because they had to lay off so many staff members during the pandemic when travel was almost at a standstill, that they were not in a position to scale back up fast enough. There was one destination, Mr. President, that said to us, they scaled back up immediately when they were allowed to fly again to 100% of their routes and 100% of their flights. The level of cancellations to all kinds of routes was so high that the government intervened and said, you are not to fly at more than 50% capacity of your original routes until you can ramp back up, until you can crew back up, until you can recruit pilots at a fast enough rate, until you can recruit crew members at a fast enough rate. You cannot fly all of the routes that you were planning to fly before. You also have instances, Mr. President, where you have airlines that will tell you, I have 100 planes sitting on a tarmac, but I don't have enough crew to crew them, so they can't fly, Mr. President. So the ability of a country and of an industry to have certified professionals is critical to air transportation and critical to our aviation sector. And so now we will see ICAO evolving in another 2 years. We expect, based on what is already in the pipeline, to have even crew members of international carriers also part of the certification system. So there is an extensive body of work and reform and certification that is required for international aviation. It is simply not just the process of getting on a plane and flying from point A to point B, or attracting a plane and having it parked here on the tarmac, getting on and getting off. It is our ability to be able to ensure the safety of that plane and therefore the safety of the bodies on that plane, including passengers and crew. And that is where, Mr. President, Barbados is going. And so the legislation that we have here now is of the 2007 vintage, the original Civil Aviation Authority legislation. It was amended once in 2019. Certainly, we had to make some changes at the time, but this now is a comprehensive reform of the overall legislation to ensure that we now keep pace with the various annexes of the Chicago Convention and we meet the ICAO standards. Now, once we started to do this work, ICAO then came alongside. ICAO did the following, and I want to publicly express the appreciation of the government of Barbados for the work provided, the support given by ICAO. ICAO came down here, their Vice President for the Americas, and I mentioned it briefly before, but I want to specify what they did. They sat with me and with the aviation team that we created, and they said, well, this is a whole lot of work. We're happy with Barbados that you're now at the stage where you actually have the draft of the legislation, but how are you going to implement it? And we said, but look, Barbados is not a jurisdiction that has a long history of people who are skilled in all of the critical elements and who have all of the full training in all of the critical elements. We will need support. If it is our ambition as well to attract additional carriers into the country, there are a number of areas in which we will need support. And ICAO said the following to me and the team. They said, okay, we expect that based on your timeline for passing the legislation, you will be in a position to have the audit done, having done all of the work within a period of 18 months. And I said to them, you know who my boss is? I report to a prime minister whose name is Mia Amor-Motley. You may have heard about her. She's microwave generation, even though she really isn't. Everything is urgent, everything is a priority, and everything must be done now. So 18 months is not going to work. And they said, what do you want to do then, Minister? And I said, what is the shortest time frame within which we could get this done if you were to give us technical assistance? And they said, we could provide you with technical assistance, and if we were to provide you with the technical assistance, which is the reason why this bill is important and timely to pass today, I'm hoping that we can count on the support of all of our partners, we will be able to get it done in 9 months. So from 18 months to 9 months, they said we can do it. I said, okay, so I want to do it in 9 months, but what do I need to do in order to get it done in the 9 months? They said, here's what we will do for you. We will send you a team of experts for a period of 3 years. They will start with you at the passage of the legislation. They will come down to Barbados. In the first instance, we will send 8 technical specialists. 8, not 1, not 2, not 3. We have had 3 since January 2021, and they helped us to get to this stage. But we will send, under the ICAO Technical Assistance Program, 8 professionals in a range of disciplines to train and build capacity in Barbados to enable Barbados to meet the 8 critical elements and to allow you to pass the ICAO audit in 9 months. And that is what ICAO committed to doing. In September, therefore, at the ICAO General Assembly, we had the opportunity and the privilege to sign a multilateral partnership agreement with ICAO, which allowed us to access and tap into that level of support. And once we are able to cross the hurdle of passing this legislation, those experts will be deployed to Barbados to stay in Barbados full-time to work with our teams here to build Barbados's capacity in civil aviation over, in the first instance, a 9-month period, and then ultimately working in each incremental stage over a 3-year period. That is a commitment that ICAO gave to Barbados, and I want to express our appreciation for that. In addition, we then contracted through the Grantley Adams International Airport a separate set of consulting professionals who were responsible for working with us on aviation safety. I do not have to say, Mr. President, I know all Barbadians saw the report in November of 2021 on that day when we had an unfortunate incident where an item that should not have been able to clear the airport, passed the airport, and was reported in the international news that a plane originating in Barbados had this item on it. It was a weapon, it should not have been there, and it passed. So what was the response of the government of Barbados? Because aviation safety is critical. No one wants to be on an aircraft with a weapon that is possibly able to be used in a way that is not expected. We immediately, Mr. President, reached out, and we were thankful to have had persons in the government of the United States who were able to recommend professionals with whom we can work. And immediately after that incident, within weeks, Mr. President, we had a team of professionals who we contracted thereafter to the Grantley Adams International Airport, and they have been working with us ever since, specifically on aviation security. They constitute, Mr. President, professionals who are former TSA, former Customs and Border Protection of the United States, and former ICAO. They have been working, a team of 3 professionals at the highest level of the Transport and Safety Authority of the United States, Customs and Border Protection of the USA, and ICAO, the entity that I have just mentioned. And they have been working with Barbados on our aviation security since last November, Mr. President. So you have aviation safety experts working with us since January 2021, aviation security professionals working with us since November 2021, and we now have today, in November 2022, Mr. President, the passage of this comprehensive body of legislation. But we did not stop there. Under the ICAO IPAV program, Mr. President, which is a technical assistance program specifically focusing on providing legal technical assistance, we also had a legal expert provided under technical assistance from ICAO. And they worked with us for a period of 8 weeks, Mr. President, to review the draft of the legislation alongside the CPC of Barbados to ensure that what we were crafting was in compliance with what ICAO expected. But we went even further then, Mr. President. So we didn't stop there either, Mr. President, because one of the ambitions that this government has had when it first made the policy decision in 2019 to establish the Civil Aviation Authority was that it would set a trajectory to propel Barbados into Category 1 status. And Category 1 status comes from the FAA of the United States, which opens up a whole new world for aviation for Barbados. What did we agree, Mr. President, when the Vice President for the Americas of ICAO came here? We agreed, Mr. President, that within that 9-month time frame, within which we would be working on getting to the 80% threshold with ICAO, that we would conduct and we would invite the FAA down to Barbados to do an interim review. And that interim review, which would say Barbados is now at 70%. 75% of where ICAO needs to be. And if they have met this threshold, where are the gaps for the FAA to ensure that we're also able to meet the Category 1 status, so that by the time we hit the 9-month time frame for ICAO, that we are already in compliance or near to compliance with meeting the FAA requirements for Category 1. That is the body of work that we have immersed ourselves in, Mr. President, on this aviation legislation over the last 2 years. And I am incredibly proud to have shepherded an incredible team to this page where, Mr. President, we can now prepare to present this in a public space for passage by the Senate of Barbados. Mr. President, there is more. While in Montreal, Mr. President, there were so many countries that have seen the long journey that Barbados has taken. They have seen the steps that Barbados has taken, Mr. President, and they all pledged their support. And so we got offers of support from partners who included Singapore, who have made available to Barbados support for our International Civil Aviation Authority and its creation and the training of our professionals. We received support from the United Arab Emirates, Mr. President, who also agreed on an annual basis to provide Barbados with scholarships for persons who would go and train and return to work in our Civil Aviation Authority. We got support, Mr. President, from Malaysia. Malaysia also gave the commitment that we would collaborate. But closer to home as well, Mr. President, we also got the support of one of our regional neighbors, the Bahamas, with whom we have been working very closely over the last 6 months. So that in instances where Barbados needs to certify an aircraft and we do not have the technical skills here, that we will reach out to our neighbors in the Bahamas in particular, and we will be able to build capacity in order to be able to do that. Mr. President, it has been a long, collaborative journey of which we are incredibly proud. Now, Mr. President, when this legislation was first drafted, it included the 2 elements which are captured in the subsidiary legislation referred to in order paper in order number 3. It included civil aviation, the accident investigation unit. It included the air navigation services. Now, Mr. President, the ICAO legal expert, as well as the aviation security and safety experts, all made the recommendation that these 2 elements needed to be separated and separate and distinct from the Civil Aviation Authority. In essence, Mr. President, what would have happened if we had kept order number 3 included within the provisions of order number 2 would have been the Civil Aviation Authority effectively regulating and investigating itself. And so the Air Navigation Services, Mr. President, and the Accident Investigation Services Unit are now captured under separate legislation, which will not fall under the Civil Aviation Authority, but will fall under the authority of the Ministry with responsibility for international transport, and they will have a direct relation, but the two will report into each other, but they will be separate and distinct entities. Now, Mr. President, there has been a considerable amount of engagement also with the Public Service of Barbados on the creation of posts to allow for us to staff these authorities. And I want to take a moment to recognize the extraordinary hard work that has been done by our air traffic controllers. There is a need, Mr. President, and this is one of the things that will come as a policy outcome from the government of Barbados in due course. There is a need for a further investment in our Civil Aviation Authority as it relates to air traffic control and our air traffic controllers. Our equipment is in need of an upgrade. There's capital works, our capital expenditure that is needed in terms of our Civil Aviation Authority, the tower for air traffic control, and the investment in technology upgrades as well. Those are things that will come along the way as a consequence of us establishing a Civil Aviation Authority. But that notwithstanding, even though those things have not yet happened, Mr. President, our air traffic controllers show up every single day and make sure that Barbados is not the place where we have accidents as a matter of course, and they protect our airspace, they protect our aerodrome, and I would wish to commend them for the extraordinary work that they have done and they continue to do every single day. Now, Mr. President, this is not a small feat. All of us remember waking up one morning to ashfall. We know what it looked like outside when we looked outside. We couldn't see our cars, we couldn't see the trees. Everything was covered in ash. But what we do not know, Mr. President, is what it would have been like to be an air traffic controller or to be responsible for an aerodrome after ashfall at an international airport. And Mr. President, again, I commend the team at the Barbados Civil Aviation Department because we worked day in and day out with the team at the Grantley Adams International Airport, with the Civil Aviation Department, and with the air traffic controllers, but also with our engineering teams, Mr. President. There is something very specific, I am told, about ash in an aircraft engine. Something very specific about ash, Mr. President, anywhere connected to aircraft equipment. And so the engineers did a stellar job of ensuring that in the first instance, we were able to prepare and clear the runway and the aerodrome in its entirety, because we weren't just clearing the runway, we had to clear literally all of the aprons, we had to clear the taxiways, we had to clear the drains. And because we were in St. Philip, what we were seeing on the border of St. Philip, you were seeing also the ash blowing from in the easterly areas down as fast as you could clear the runway, the ash was coming down onto the runway from above it. And so you had a considerable amount of work to get done over the course of 6 days to prepare the airport for complete reopening and to have it cleared and ready and safe for aircraft traffic. The Barbados Civil Aviation Department, when reconstituted, the Barbados Civil Aviation Authority was the certifying entity that made the determination about whether the aircraft, the aerodrome was safe or not. Not amateur pilot flying up in an airplane to fly a small craft, don't know, can't tell you whether we are cleared to travel or not, whether we are fit to receive aircraft or not. There are specialist skills that are required and were available to Barbados in the Civil Aviation Department by people who are certified by ICAO, not anybody who is now learning to fly for sport, by ICAO. And I saw some unfortunate commentary with people posting, social media can be good and it can be bad. But during that time, I saw some people purporting to be experts. And the ICAO don't know nothing about them, never see them once anywhere in any of their training courses, but because they were learning to fly light aircraft, they suddenly became experts and people believed what they said as real. Not realizing that there was some real damage that could potentially have been done to our reputation as an international transport, in terms of international transport, if the information had actually been misused. But people have to be careful not to assert to be experts on things that they are not, just because there's something maybe functioning tangentially in a given space. But thankfully, the Barbados Civil Aviation Department and its licensed inspectors were able to certify the aerodrome and the airport, therefore, for clearance and the resumption of airline traffic once more after the ashfall. And those are the people who have worked day in and day out to help us get to this stage. And I want, Mr. President, with your permission, to beg your permission to call their names as the heads of those agencies, because many times people don't see them and they don't recognize the important work that they do. And so the Director of Civil Aviation, her name is Mrs. Tracy Ford Bailey. She has been an excellent professional and she has worked tirelessly to get us to this stage. Her deputy is Mr. Carlisle Simmons, and he, in her absence, the two of them are actually the two certified inspectors who work in certifying and who have worked on the development of this legislation as well. I don't have the time, Mr. President, and I can't possibly call every single inspector, every single air traffic controller by name, but I would want to recognize them as well. Every single engineer, I cannot call them by name, but I want to recognize them as well. The CEO of the Grant Adams International Airport himself, a former air traffic controller, Mr. Hadley Bourne, and his team, they too have contributed in no small measure to where we are today, and I would wish to publicly commend them for the work which they have done. Mr. President, this is a body of legislation that speaks to the kinds of issues that I have just outlined. But there is more. Mr. President, in 2021, we approved as a cabinet the development of an aviation strategy for Barbados. We worked with a company based out of Canada, Aviation Week, Aviation Network, and they, along with a team of experts, developed an aviation strategy for Barbados. What is the purpose of establishing a civil aviation authority, Mr. President, if you don't look at the downstream opportunities for the country? What is the purpose of looking at the creation of meeting the level of civil aviation, of FAA approval for Category 1, if you're not looking at the downstream opportunities, Mr. President? And the aviation strategy, therefore, Mr. President, that we created in 2021, identified the range of sectors and industries that are trending globally, that a small island developing state that proposes to establish itself as a logistics hub for maritime and for aviation could look at developing. And it included, Mr. President, sectors like maintenance and repair operations. That is included within our aviation strategy. It includes, Mr. President, the development of the skills to support maintenance and repair operations. We already have one entity at the airport. In due course, we expect to have a second one, which is already underway. We expect to see that soon. But, Mr. President, who are the skills? I just talked about my experience on a plane taking off and having to come back and deal with engineers. We need to make sure that we're able to build a cadre of skilled professionals who are able to function in the space of maintenance and repair operations of aircraft at the airport, and that work is underway. We have work being done already by the Barbados Light Aircraft Club as well on the training of pilots. But why would we need, Mr. President, to have persons who are trained as pilots leave Barbados in their entirety to be able to get their commercial pilot's license and have to travel overseas if it is that we are developing an aviation strategy? It was our ambition while I was in the ministry, and because the government has not changed, it is still the same government, we would wish to have the training capacity built here in Barbados to allow for us to train pilots all the way up to the highest level in partnership with international entities that we would want to attract here in Barbados. Mr. President, I could go on and on and on. We also have been looking, Mr. President, at the logistics, and we've talked about what the logistics of that looks like. Mr. President, it is an interesting thing that for however long, Barbados has historically been used to seeing the charter aircraft flying into Barbados, landing at the Grant Adams International Airport, persons getting on board a bus and being transported to the Bridgetown port where they board a cruise ship, sail out of Barbados, and the reverse also takes place, where they get off of the ship in Bridgetown port and board a bus to Grant Adams International Airport where they board an aircraft. Mr. President, that is people moving in what we call a corridor, a seamless corridor, a sterile corridor. And equally so, we would wish to see the time come, Mr. President, where logistics takes a similar approach for goods, moving seamlessly from maritime to air to Barbados being transshipped from one place to the other and having the infrastructure and the investment attraction in order to facilitate that. All of those things are inbuilt into Barbados's draft aviation strategy, Mr. President. They're all their work that I said we started in 2021 and we expect to see unfolding with the introduction of the Civil Aviation Authority and the creation of an aviation industry more broadly. Mr. President, there's another element of that, which is technology. During COVID, Mr. President, all of the things and many of the things that we said could not be done were done. Many of the things that we thought required people to be in person no longer existed. People then went online. We were then able to have a whole lot of sectors moving their services and government as well, moving our services online. And Mr. President, right before, I believe it was in early October, we had a number of meetings with the airline partners. And with the airline partners, we discussed with them migrating, actually, we did it in August as well, International Civil Aviation Day in September, and then we also met with the airlines on this. Mr. President, we introduced all across the globe a series of travel solutions using technology during COVID. IATA had the travel pass. American Airlines and JetBlue, they used VeriFly. You had ArriveCan for Canada, and you had different mechanisms for different countries. Every country allowed you to upload your information in advance, and it was meant to make your entry in and out of countries seamless. If you're entering the United States, you have global entry from certain countries if you're eligible to apply for global entry. And you can join the global entry program of the TSA and move seamlessly. Mr. President, we also integrated as part of our aviation strategy rollout seamless travel in Barbados, which allowed you also to transition your technology platforms introduced during COVID for the purpose of post-COVID. And why would that matter, Mr. President? Mr. President, there are some real technical elements to some of the things that we do that we sometimes may dismiss. Barbados is the most southerly country in the Eastern Caribbean. It is a country that is on the periphery, on the outside. What that means, Mr. President, and the airlines will tell you, we are 100 miles from St. Lucia, Mr. President. And that 100 miles from St. Lucia makes a difference between whether or not an airline flying from certain gateways in the United States can turn and go back into the United States and still make bank. It means the difference between, Mr. President, 10 minutes in both directions, whether outgoing and coming. If an airline is able to go back in an environment where I mentioned already, there are airline shortages, there are aircraft shortages, there are pilot shortages. So they have to use fewer resources than they had before in order to get to the same results. And so, Mr. President, if an airline, 100 miles difference between St. Lucia and Barbados, needs to have that time shaved in terms of how quickly they can get back to their bank and use that same aircraft to meet their domestic travel obligations from one city in the United States to the next, solutions like seamless travel will make Barbados even more of an attractive destination when you layer it on top of a new civil aviation architecture, a push to get Category 1 status, and then overall, an ease of doing business in aviation. These are some of the initiatives, Mr. President, that are captured within Barbados's draft aviation strategy. And we are hoping, we are expecting that alongside the private sector, alongside our international partners, that Barbados will evolve ultimately, not just into a new regulatory framework, which I have already just outlined, but also, Mr. President, into a space where aviation becomes a new industry for jobs, for businesses, and for Barbados and Barbadians to thrive alike, Mr. President. In closing, I want specifically also to speak to the overall agenda for aviation reform generally and the work that is going to be done on the aviation authority in the short term. Mr. President, the expectation is that there will be the need for some investment in the Civil Aviation Authority by way of the provision of upgrades to our simulator, upgrades to the technology used in the Civil Aviation Authority itself, but also the recruitment of skills. And this is where I want to land, Mr. President. Mr. President, these are not jobs that don't require training and skills. They require extensive training, extensive skills development. And I'm hopeful that in partnership with our tertiary level institutions, including the SJPI and the University of the West Indies and the Barbados Community College, that we are then going to be in a position to develop what that framework looks like as a country. But Mr. President, one of the things that the Civil Aviation Department has navigated is this. It is very difficult because this is now going to separate the Civil Aviation Department from the Civil Aviation Authority. Civil Aviation Authority is going to be a semi-autonomous unit from government, owned and operated by government, but it is going to function outside of the main public service. And why is that important, Mr. President? We have found difficulty recruiting the kinds of skills that we actually need to run the authority at the salary scales and with the skills and the experience that are necessary. And I think it is time for us as a country to stop mincing words about recruiting highly skilled professionals and remunerating them appropriately. Mr. President, you cannot find persons who are retired pilots or persons who have been who have had the level of expertise that you need to do some of these highly skilled areas without having adequate remuneration. And so that is one of the things that has been an obstacle to us. And we have been working through that, Mr. President, to ensure that under the new Civil Aviation Authority, that we are able to, one, recruit and then retain. Because what other authorities in the region have seen is that, one, you're able to recruit people, but because of the level of remuneration globally and the demand for these skills, you are not able to retain them. They are recruited by other authorities elsewhere, and they migrate very quickly. And one of the things that we were able to do, Mr. President, when it came to the discussions with some of our partners who have offered us scholarships, they have insisted these persons must be bonded. There must be a commitment for them to return to the country and work, because the purpose of training them is to build your capacity. But oftentimes what we see is that the opportunities in other jurisdictions and the remuneration in other jurisdictions becomes so attractive that it is difficult for persons, once they have completed their training and their scholarships, to want to come back home. But the purpose for which they were sent is to bring them back home. And so we have to ensure that we look then at the package that we offer to persons so that we can not only recruit them, but keep them and get them operating at the highest possible level. And Barbados then also being able to recruit and attract persons in every sector functioning at the highest possible level. Now, Mr. President, this is the matter before this honourable chamber. So we have spoken about the substantive legislation establishing the authority. I have outlined and explained, I hope, the differences between why we would have the authority itself separated from the Accident Investigation Unit and the Air Navigation Services. And I've explained as well, Mr. President, the role played by ICAO and others. I've also outlined the trajectory that we have set for ourselves in terms of Category 1 status and the role being played by the FAA. I want to close on this one point, Mr. President. All of this work, the remapping of the aerodrome, even when we redid the runway at the end of 2020, that work was finished in February of last year. When that work was done, we had to do a complete remapping of the aerodrome for the purpose of air navigation safety. All of that work had to be done and was completed this year. Mr. President, the reason why that is important as well is because for over 30 years, Barbados, in the absence of having done all of this work, in the absence of our ability to manage our air navigation services, has not had control over our upper airspace. Our upper airspace has been and continues to be managed by a third party. That third party has been able to accumulate not just the navigation services, but the fees associated with navigation services for over 30 years, Mr. President. It is important that Barbados does not simply say, we deserve or we have a right to manage our upper airspace as well as our lower airspace, but that we put the mechanisms in place that will make the case to the international community that we have the capacity to manage our upper airspace. And this suite of legislation that we are bringing before this honorable chamber today, the Civil Aviation Authority giving the creation of an entity to manage it, the Air Navigation Systems Unit given the authority to treat to navigation systems overall, the Accident Investigation Services Unit, Mr. President, in the event that, God forbid, something goes wrong. This suite of legislation combined with the technical assistance by the ICAO and the support of the agencies that I just mentioned. I did have the opportunity to meet with the head of the TSA in Montreal in September, and they have also committed to providing any technical assistance and all support that Barbados would need. These combined interventions, Mr. President, give Barbados a clear runway, pun intended, to begin the process of treating to the management of our upper airspace. That is the trajectory ultimately that Barbados is going to go on. And I would wish, therefore, Mr. President, that having outlined all of the things that I have shared, having taken us through the legislation, having taken us through the subsidiary pieces of legislation, having outlined the framework of the aviation strategy, having outlined the work that we are now looking to do with ICAO and with the FAA, we expect, and where we ultimately intend to land as an aviation hub in the Southern Caribbean, functioning at the highest possible international standards, that I can commend this legislation to this honorable chamber. And on that basis, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. I would like to begin by thanking Senator Cummings for what I can only describe as a comprehensive presentation of the issues, the history, and the background to the document which we're considering today. Mr. President, I have seen the act which has been brought to this honorable chamber, and which, among other things, seeks to establish the Civil Aviation Authority. The functions of the authority are clearly defined. Its board of management, responsibilities for policy, administration, and the various aspects are clearly outlined. It is clear that the Act reflects an effort to modernize our civil aviation relations and to implement appropriate compliance with the international standards. There can be no doubt that the safety of our airport and air travel to and from Barbados must be a national priority. The conversion of the department that manages the civil aviation matters into a new authority and other elements of comprehensive reform are important advances for our country. The cooperation and support that has been received, as outlined by Senator Cummings, from international agencies and from friendly countries in this process should be recognized and applauded. I also think that our government should be complimented for the steps that have been taken to modernize this aspect of our development. But, Mr. President, I have a concern. My concern reflects or relates to the fact that nowhere in the document presented did I see any mention of the costs that would be involved in the implementation of the new entity. I assume, Mr. President, that the Civil Aviation Authority will be a new state-owned enterprise. If this is so, and if it is classified as such, what are the financial implications of its establishment? I remember, Mr. President, that in the proposals for the BIRD 2 program, which were discussed and approved here in this chamber not so long ago, the transformation and reform of state-owned enterprises was considered one of the ways by which government intends to create value for money for the citizens of Barbados and approaches to modernize our country. If this is so, then in my opinion, the establishment of any new state-owned enterprise should be accompanied by appropriate analysis of its financial viability and its financial implications for the budget of the country. In other words, Mr. President, is there a feasibility plan for the new entity? What is the current cost of the provision of these services? And what are the future costs that would be involved in the new arrangements and the new proposals that have been presented? Will the entity that has been proposed be self-sustaining? Or will it be subsidized, or will it need to be subsidized by the taxpayers of Barbados? Mr. President, I truly believe that this is an important piece of legislation. It's an important step forward for us. But I also believe that any new entity that is being proposed should be brought to us accompanied by an appropriate feasibility plan, an indication of costs, an indication of the financial viability of the same. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Bradford. Her Honor, Senator Henrietta Elizabeth Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for giving me my full title. I embrace it particularly as I celebrated a 61st birthday yesterday. Thank you. I must confess that I never saw myself at this age, really. So it is a shock to me, and I'm still trying to reconcile myself to the number 61. Yeah, I'm trying very hard. But I spent, it was an opportunity for reflection on where I am as a person. You know, you grow, you should grow as you age, and the sort of role that I've played in national life and where Barbados is and where we need to go. And therefore, I'm particularly pleased to come back to a debate. And I actually rushed home from Egypt, the COP, to get to Barbados to participate in this debate, having been away for some time. Well, to come to the floor of the Senate, to come to the Senate, not necessarily for this debate, because whatever business was being done today, I very much wanted to be at home and present. I want to pick up on the points raised by Dr. Brathwaite, Senator Dr. Brathwaite, which I think have some legitimacy, and that is the issue of the cost. And I want to perhaps open the question of cost to the issue of state-owned enterprises on the whole, which are often the Achilles heel of government in terms of governance, in terms of expenditure, in terms of oversight, in terms of reporting to the nation on the use of taxpayers' funds. And often when boards are put in place, and let's admit it, they change with every government, and some of them are given to tremendous excesses depending on the chairman or how the board is constituted. And therefore, government, not the Barbados Labour Party government or the Democratic Labour Party government, but government has a responsibility to the taxpayers, not just to deal with central government, but really to deal with issues relating to the governance, financing, and financial expenditures of state-owned enterprises to ensure that they are in line with the policies of the government, the strategies of the government, the overall vision and direction, because some of these SOEs can actually be on frolics of their own. I think that there is another question to be posed, and it is on the future of state-owned enterprises generally. There has been a tendency to move functions out of central government and place them within the framework of state-owned enterprises. And quite frankly, sometimes it happens precisely to avoid extensive oversight and the use of some of the rules to which central government is expected to conform. Sometimes it happens because it is believed that state-owned enterprises can be a faster method or faster mechanism for delivery of goods or services, and that they are not subject to the heavy bureaucracy and rules of government, and therefore can satisfy citizens' demands and country needs in a far more effective and rapid manner than central government. But a key question that I think this government needs to pose to itself is really, what is the role and function of government? What type of government are we planning for a 21st century Barbados, not just now in 2022, but in 2050 and beyond? Will the government be largely a regulatory agency? Is government going to be an operational entity formulating, or is it going to be a policy formulator? Is it going to be a regulator? Because depending on the nature and structure and form of government, the state-owned enterprises will have to reflect that philosophical and strategic positioning, and we will have to determine what kinds of SOEs we need to carry the country forward and to position Barbados to achieve what are our large objectives and vision as a new republic. And it is significant that we're having these kinds of conversations as we celebrate our first year of true, complete independence and self-government. I want then to congratulate the minister and her team and the consultants that supported them for excellent work. This is a non-sexy part of government. Governance, regulations, structures, forms, delivery. It is not something that people think about in the way they think about state-owned enterprises like BTMI, for instance, or the Queen Elizabeth Hospital or others. It is not in the forefront of our minds. But getting this right was absolutely important to Barbados. And it is embarrassing to note that we could not meet the standards and could not pass an audit for many years prior to this government taking over. It is all the more of a disgrace when you couple it with the fact that the radar in the port was not working, another major security breach. It is embarrassing in the context that at the time we were also having negative travel advisories. And when you locate all of this in context, you really see that there were several omissions of government and governance prior to 2018, and that these have to be corrected. Correcting them requires hard, concentrated work that is not immediately in the public eye, that you will probably not get any applause for in the way that if you had corrected perhaps something at the QEH, you would get kudos and a lot of public attention. And therefore, I want to thank the minister for sticking to it, for aspiring to do it in record time, for achieving that, and for delivering to the public of Barbados on this central issue. And I applaud you, Madam Minister. It seems to me, from a review of what the minister said, that there are 6 things that are addressed here. The establishment of a new body for civil aviation matters, the governance and improved governance of civil aviation matters, the modernization and efficiency of matters relating to civil aviation, positioning Barbados to meet international standards relative to civil aviation, and the safety within the rules of civil aviation, and finally, capacity building in the sector of civil aviation. I said 6, that I believe is a list of 7. These are important because Barbados sees itself as a premier tourism destination. We see ourselves as a major tourism hub in the region. We are now talking about becoming a transit and hub between Africa and Latin America, of getting goods and services and people more quickly to the Panama Canal and beyond, using international transit lanes and transit points. And internationally, using air routes and opening up new air routes, so that for us to be able to meet internationally accepted standards for achieving these national objectives and these strategic imperatives is of extreme importance. And I'm glad that we have been able to do that work and that the minister has been able to report to us, job accomplished. It also shows that the business of government really has to do with addressing issues of this sort, not just things that attract a lot of attention in the public domain, but the things that make a significant difference to our revenue earning capacity, to ensuring that we do not have reputational damage. Because while we have been lucky enough not to have any negative air incident or any major accident, had there been one, and all of this had become public, that we were not internationally certified, that we were not up to the standard to meet audits, we would have sustained significant, serious, and sustained reputational damage, all as a tourism sector and as a country that is promoting itself as a place to do trade and business, to do it efficiently, to do it well, and to be able to compare with acceptably international standards. So I'm glad that were there now, and I pray God that there is not, some kind of accident or incident, that we are at the standard required and can say, and we can be recognized as having met those standards. But I see in this an important capacity building opportunity. Capacity building in the context of civil aviation, and the minister laid it out well. but it is also capacity building as a small island developing state. Because if we are aspiring to play a significant leadership role among small island developing states and to keep, as Kofi Annan put it when he was here, so graciously put it, keep punching above our weight, then we must equip ourselves to deliver those punches. And this allows us to do so, the building of capacity. I think that the minister really gave us a very interesting story. I have one of my own and I'm going to share it. I was coming back from the United States and we were about to board. They've announced departure. The captain of the plane comes off and he starts walking to us in groups and he apologizes and he says, I'm really very sorry, but I don't have enough fuel on the plane to get you all to Barbados. So people start saying, I want to say, look at me like, we should go home, yeah. You know, Barbadians. And he said, no, I assure you it's fine. I'm going to fly down to Fort Lauderdale. I can get to Fort Lauderdale. I will pick up some fuel in Fort Lauderdale. And from Fort Lauderdale, we'll get you down to sunny Barbados. And people are looking at this pilot like, this man for real? You know, it really was an unbelievable story, but it speaks to what has happened and is happening post-COVID and with the Ukraine war and the changes that are happening at international airports. And the airport that I'm talking about wasn't any Nene airport in the Hickeys anywhere. I'm talking about coming out of JFK International in New York. I mean, that a pilot could tell you, I do not have enough fuel. I cannot get it here. I have to fly to Fort Lauderdale. It's shocking, shocking. So that there is a whole change that is happening in the airline industry. Many pilots have retired. A lot of people who worked in the airlines in that early period when the airlines started to downsize and ask staffs to take, early period of COVID, ask staff to take early retirement and to accept payout packages and so on, people left the industry. And now you have find that you go into JFK, for instance, and you want to eat before you get on board JetBlue because, you know, it's really snacks only. And they tell you, well, I'm sorry, we don't have any cooks. We don't have any service staff. You have to wait an hour to get a meal. That's the best we can do. So if you don't have an hour, where previously it was 20 minutes to half hour, you might as well not wait for a meal because they can't serve it. All of that is happening in the industry, but it has shown up where the opportunities lie. And Barbados, because we have a well-educated population, now has the opportunity to get into specializations in civil aviation, as airline pilots, as other skilled personnel, as aircraft mechanics, and the whole gamut of skill sets that are used in the airline industry, which are now in heavy demand globally, and of which there is a severe shortage. And I want to make the point here. A lot of our young people, I met a young lady who was quarreling with me and telling me, there's a serious brain drain in Barbados, and y'all aren't doing anything about it, and y'all are losing all the young people who aren't being trained. And I listened to her very patiently, and I said, there is no brain drain in Barbados, and we are not losing all our young people. She said, oh, you don't know what brain drain means? I said, I think I do. And I explained to her. She said to me she trained as a journalist, and she was unable to get a job in Barbados. And she had gone to Canada and was thinking about doing other things. And I said to her, I don't know how many people were trained in your year, but did you anticipate that the radio stations, which have now moved to DJs as opposed to trained announcers of a certain type, they're DJs, dominating the airwaves, and the Advocate is barely functioning. I don't know if it still is. And The Nation would have at this stage their full gamut of reporters and one or two other media houses. So if 30 people were trained in your class, and there may have been more than 30, where did you think you were all going to work? Surely you cannot all work in Barbados. And we are training our young people to send them overseas to fill the demands in the international marketplace so that the benefits for Barbados are going to be repatriated wherever they go. I just came from Egypt. The manager of a hotel called me aside to say the Barbados delegation was voted by our staff as the nicest delegation of all the delegations we have. Manager of a hotel, 350 guests from the conference stayed there at that hotel, and they said the Barbados delegation stood out. And therefore, when those trained young people go overseas, they must stand out and be distinguished from others because of the quality of their work, their language skills, and the way they carry themselves. And he said to me, you are an exceptional ambassador for your country. You typify what I think an ambassador should be. Well, of course, he didn't have a conversation with them, so he could believe that. But it is a different thing being engaged on the domestic front at the political level and then plying your trade at the international level. The point I'm making here, however, is that we are not just training young people for a local market, but when they go overseas, they are Bajan wherever they go. Their ties will remain to Barbados. At some point, they will want to buy property here. They want to repatriate something. They will come back and give of themselves, and we really have to try very hard to utilize the Barbadian diaspora, its networks, its resources, its finances, and its goodwill. And I identify the diaspora as those who have been trained here and young people who were born here, but the descendants of those who are born here, many of those themselves who do not know Barbados or who come to Barbados only as visitors, but see themselves as Bajan, retain an interest in the country, want to help, want to contribute, want to be engaged, want to come for crop over, want to buy a house or a piece of land, want to make an investment. And we are not sufficiently maximizing that. So I think that the opportunity for jobs, for training, not just to work in Barbados and build out the industry and the full suite of skills here, but to position young people to take the opportunities available now internationally where there is high demand for skills because of the impact that COVID has had on the labor force and because our young people have strong technology skills, and it is entirely possible. Many jobs are now allowing people to work remotely, to work from home, to come in one day a week, to come in one day every 6 months, or to not come in at all. The key thing is that you are providing the service, they are monitoring your productivity, and your check is in the bank at the end of the month. And our young people will be able to work from Barbados in many spheres of endeavor. The point is that they have to understand that the labor market has changed, and this notion that the nation will employ you or you are going to go in somebody's space, you have to create the space within which you are going to work. You have to become more entrepreneurial. You have to see where the opportunities are and position yourselves. And some of them are not sufficiently, I don't want to say aggressive because that is a word that is used so pejoratively, but they must be very proactive in seeking opportunities and not waiting for opportunities to come to them or to come home at mommy and daddy for them. There is another component to this to which the minister did not speak and on which I would like to go. And it is, thank you, it is the issue of civil aviation and the nexus with climate change. I mean, having just come back from a climate change conference, an international conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, commonly called UNFCCC. It would be remiss of me not to try to speak to Barbadians about that connection. I want to start by making perhaps what some may perceive as a political point, which is that when Barbadians ask, what is the value of us going to these international meetings? My response is simply this. The world is changing, and Barbados is changing with it. We are one of the frontline countries in relation to climate change. We have been pushed onto those front lines, not by our own actions, but by the actions of others. It is a front line from which we cannot escape. We are addressing a cost of climate that we can ill afford. And there is upon us the responsibility for this and future generations to address the consequences and the ravages of climate on society, economy, and environment for our people. And we cannot influence the space if we stay home and drink our rum and cokes or eat our ham cutters. You have to be in the space fighting at the negotiating tables. Fighting at the negotiating tables to ensure that the language that you want, to ensure that your interests are protected. And for people who think that these are jaunts, let me tell you what my experience was in the last 4 days of the conference. Meetings went until 1 a.m. And I just said that I'm 61 years old. I turned up at 8 o'clock in the morning when my first meeting started and left at 1 o'clock in the morning of the next day. Yes, I know I have stamina. And yes, I know that I look good for my age. But no, I'm very serious. I was having pull-asides. Pull-aside is when you want to talk to another minister or diplomat, and it isn't a formal meeting. You see them, like you say, Mr. President, let's have a word on this matter. This is of grave concern to my country. And therefore, you step aside. Literally, it's a pull-aside. Or bilaterals. I had bilaterals at midnight on Friday night. Midnight on Friday night, I'm doing bilaterals with ministers. When the people who are cursing you about being out on these joints in their beds sleeping or liming. Midnight. I saw that the United Nations did some tweets and so with me. Those speeches were made at 12:30 and 1 o'clock in the morning, 12:45 in the morning. They were not made at 3 or 4 o'clock in the evening during regular working hours. They were capturing me when I was at the desk fighting for Barbados, fighting for the people of Barbados as head of the Barbados delegation, left there by a prime minister who had made her mark on the conference, when everybody was quoting her, when the Secretary General was quoting her, when Prime Minister Macron, President Macron was saying, I am going to convene the kind of convocation that the Prime Minister of Barbados has spoken about. When other presidents and prime ministers were saying, I support the Prime Minister of Barbados on the reform of the IFIs and the multilateral development banks. When people were saying the Bridgetown Initiative is the initiative with which we want to associate because it speaks to a new paradigm and a reframing of the world system that needs to change if small island developing states and other developing countries are to be positioned for a new place in the world. You don't get that by staying home. You get it when you get on a plane and fly. And there's a cost to it, but there's a benefit to it. And I am happy to say today, and I will speak to how I see the benefits of the climate change meeting, that Barbados brought back the benefits for the people of Barbados. I haven't gone to that meeting. So I want some of the people who are quarreling and cursing to join me at a negotiating table at 12:30. And on the last day of the conference, we were supposed to finish on the Friday. The conference went on to the Saturday. I left the conference center after 1:30 a.m. At 9 o'clock, I was walking into my first meeting that morning, Saturday morning, whatever date it was, the 19th or whatever. I left the conference center at 10:30 Sunday morning, having eaten one meal, and never left the conference center since I came this Saturday. People who say that these are jaunts don't really know what they're talking about, nor do they understand the kind of effort that it takes, the kind of hard work that it takes, the kind of just sheer concentration and stick-to-itness, determination to push a door that is close to you. When we arrived at that conference, it was not felt that we would leave with any consensus on loss and damage, or that any fund would be agreed. Look back to what was being said in the media before the conference started. But we kicked the door open. In fact, if you were in a rum shop, somebody would say, just shove it to something open. We shoved the door open and stood in the doorway and would not budge. Antigua and Barbuda leading AOSIS. It was my honor to have been asked to have been the champion for the final text for the Alliance of Small Island States, a signal honor for Barbados. I was not a minister. People were there, countries were represented at ministerial level. And they said, we want you to be the champion. 39 countries for the Alliance of Small Island States. On what document will finally emerge from this conference? So please let us understand that this is not easy work. This is hard. And it takes constant push and struggle. But you have to be at the table, and you have to understand the issues and the political landscape, where people are going, what you can and cannot get. But I will speak to that in a different forum, Mr. President, because I wish to commend the work of Prime Minister Motley, but I want to move back to the nexus between climate change and what the Honourable Minister is doing. I think in the issue of civil aviation, we have to give consideration to how the landscape is changing and the kinds of reforms and interventions that are taking place, and how climate change is influencing those trends and macro changes. This summer, or the summer just passed, there were reports of tarmacs in London melting. Do you understand how hot it has to get for an airport to have to be closed because its tarmac was melting? And that really speaks to the issue of how we are going to engineer airports and tarmacs in the future. What a tarmac now has to withstand to remain functional. How are extreme weather events going to impact airports and related facilities? How are you going to be asked, as part of your general policy framework, particularly as a large tourism destination, to address the issue of carbon offsets? What kinds of fuel will be the aviation fuels of the future? Virgin Atlantic has already flown a plane cross Atlantic using renewable energy sources, or using non-fossil fuel sources. So if all of that is part of the structure that is changing, what does it mean for all the fuel farm tanks that you have surrounding the airport? What then does it mean for storage of the new fuels in the future? If you have to remediate, clean up or remediate a site, or close a site and then remediate, where it now exists a tank farm for fossil fuels, what is going to be the cost of that? Is that something that will affect your being certified, your being able to meet your audit requirements? All of these are new questions that have to be explored, a new positioning that has to be understood, new directions and macro trends that we have to navigate. As a small island developing state, and going back to the Honourable Dr. Brathwaite, there is a cost. What is the cost? From where will the resources come? How will we as a nation be able to afford it? But afford it we have to, if we want to stay in the game of being an international business center, in the game of being an international tourism center, in the game of being an international leader, small state, so though we may be. So all of these are issues that I want to raise, and as I said, I'm raising them in the context of aviation and new aviation standards. I note that the senator spoke to Senator Cummings, the leader of government business, in her remarks, made the point that we essentially had a partnership with ICAO. And this is perhaps the penultimate point that I would want to make before sitting. Governments give policy direction. We set the framework through regulatory regimes, but the cost of governance, the cost of implementation, the complexity of implementation is now so beyond the scope of what governments did, understood, and executed previously, that we are seeing the world as a multipolar world, where partnerships with the private sector, partnerships with universities, partnerships with international organizations and civil society, partnerships that build trust between government and its multiple stakeholders, some of whom have severe and severely conflicting interests. That these are partnerships now, which now have to be harnessed for the good of the country and for the future of the country. And therefore, in the context of civil aviation, what partnerships are we building? What resources, excuse me, sir, what resources are we obtaining in order to satisfy these new directions and these new forms of governance and government as we go forward? And I've come to closure, Mr. President, on this point. I apologize for coughing, but I have to tell you that every member of the delegation in Barbados and in Egypt came down with something. I think that the level of dust in the atmosphere, environmental conditions that we all had, we would have needed Senator Dr. Maynard. He should have been part of the delegation, and then perhaps he would have also helped to explain how necessary the delegation was and how many skills and services. Next time. No, but seriously, you don't think about these things, but every member of our delegation became impacted. And, sorry? Oh, doctor to the delegation, yes, for COP28. I'm appointing you now, and bear in mind that this appointment, I have absolutely no authority, but I appoint you, sir, I appoint you. So really, that is another thing that people don't think about, that you are going into a foreign environment. We don't allow our delegations time before or after. You send them in the day before invariably. Sometimes they've flown It took me, sir, because people don't consider this. I left Egypt on Sunday evening, Barbados time, Sunday night, and arrived in Barbados Tuesday evening. From Sharm el-Sheikh, and you have to count in airport time, I'm only calling flying time. From Sharm el-Sheikh to Cairo was an hour. And then you had some hours before you got the connecting flight. 12 hours directly to JFK. A few hours layover, and then you had to pick up to get to the airport 6 o'clock to get into Barbados. So I left Sunday and arrived Tuesday, grueling, without, and I'm here this morning, yeah. So the point that I'm making is that often, and it isn't just ministers who go to these things, it is competent civil servants. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank the entire Barbados delegation, including our very committed civil servants, because very often they get a bad rap, but sometimes, sir, our civil servants perform exceptionally. And I can tell you that at 1 o'clock, when I was sitting in the Barbados seat making speeches on behalf of our country and our region and small island states, I can tell you that when I was doing pull-asides and bilaterals at midnight, there was a civil servant either sitting behind me or at my side when I was asking technical questions, supplying me right away with notes, with answers to the questions that I was asking so that I could make the necessary interventions, watch the political nuancing, speak with, to counterparts with authority, etc. So I'm not saying that it was me or me alone or anything of the sort. I don't want to convey that impression. There was an excellent team. I'm just lamenting the fact that we didn't have a doctor because the environmental conditions were such that really the team got sick. But people did not stop working. I think 2 or 3 of us had to get medical attention while we were there because the reactions that we were having were so severe, but we kept on working. I close then with the point that we all have to make a choice. And I'm glad I mentioned our civil servants just now, because often I get the impression that the government is articulating a broad vision of where it wants to go, but it doesn't necessarily have the buy-in of all of the stakeholders who are needed to implement or effect the change. If Barbados is moving to a new standard of excellence that will typify our reputation and our performance as a republic, that will raise our flag high wherever in the world we are and in whatever enterprise we may be engaged upon, then the contribution of all stakeholders has to meet the standard of excellence. And I want to urge our country to get there. Sometimes we live on past glories, but the landscape has changed. And we must now make ourselves fit for purpose, not just for survival, but for success in this new global landscape. I am happy to say that we did so with panache in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I am happy to say that the Honourable Minister has done so on the matter of civil aviation in Barbados. I'm much obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Thompson, and happy birthday as well, well belated. Before I take the next speaker, I just want to acknowledge one of our visitors, former Senator Clyde Griffith, who was Minister of Energy back in the 1970s, I believe. 80s, 81 to 86. Welcome back to the chamber, former Senator Griffith. Speaker? Who's next? Senator Dr. Hines.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me. Get a little more space here. So this afternoon, I would like to, obviously, speak a bit on this civil aviation bill. I made my notes on the basis of, thankfully, the elucidation offered by the leader of government business, as well as what I was able to hear in the other place. I note that this civil aviation bill provides for policymaking, a regulatory and legal framework for best practices, accident investigation, air navigation services. It seeks to implement what is called, in my understanding, a full separation model that seeks to separate the regulator and the service provider. It seeks to build a body of skills, investigators, inspectors, capacity to enforce regulations. We also heard about the desire to move our airport towards Category 1. It was downgraded to Category 2 in 2011, which has some implications for the types of activities that, I should say, the aerodrome is allowed to engage in particular with regard to the US market. I'm not an expert in this area, so I am not going to pretend to be one, as Senator Cummins cautioned us and others not to try and be. And it is on this note that I really wanted to rise today, because these two pieces of legislation, the Civil Aviation Bill 2022 and the Civil Aviation Air Navigation Services and Investigation of Accidents Bill, these are very technical pieces of legislation. The two pieces of legislation are long. The first one, Civil Aviation Bill, 133 pages in 13 parts with 6 schedules. This is something that is not simple for the average person or for any of us. I'm going to go on a limb and say for any of us in here to just sit down and easily comprehend. Not that we are unintelligent, but because it is highly technical. And as Senator Cummins made us very aware, we required some expertise in order to draft this legislation because of the nature of it. The second piece of legislation, the Civil Aviation Air Navigation Services and Investigation of Accidents Bill, 51 pages in 5 parts. That is a shorter one. But again, this is a very technical area. And in the spirit of moving towards excellence, in the spirit of getting buy-in from stakeholders, all things that Senator Thompson highlighted so very well, I think it would have been appropriate to have explanatory notes come with these pieces of legislation. These are not simple things to understand, as I have already said, and for any of us to sit here and pretend that we just sat and read all of this and we were au fait with what was in here, I think is unlikely not to be factual. Did I say that correctly? It's likely not factual. Let me put it that way. That's more straightforward language. That makes more sense. So where am I getting this notion that we should have explanatory notes from? Well, we can look at the UK tradition, but we are now a republic. We are our own Caribbean state. We don't have to look at what they say in May about explanatory notes. However, I think in the spirit of best practice, which Senator Thompson also just spoke about, and you know, this legislation is supposed to get us up to international standards in terms of best practice. In terms of best practice, I think we could look at one of our neighbors, also called in this debate, Trinidad and Tobago, because in this jurisdiction, what we see is that explanatory notes are often provided so that we can all understand the intention of the legislation, the background of the legislation, the policy context, and even things such as what Senator Dr. Brathwaite highlighted, such as the potential costs of the legislation, not the legislation itself, but what the legislation seeks to effect. I think if we are striving to be excellent, these are things that are required. If we are striving to get buy-in from stakeholders, the stakeholders have to understand what it is they're buying into and not just take the word of those who stand and say, this is all what this is about. This is what this is about. This background information is important, and it can break the legislation down from the technical language into language that all of us can understand a lot better in order to do our business in here, in order to have transparency, a favorite word of this government, and to have a level of accountability to allow us to appropriately scrutinize the legislation and to offer suggestions, not just to critique. Critique is important in improving one's work as well, but also to offer suggestions so that if there are amendments that are required, and amendments can occur, that we can make them on the basis of knowledge. I do not think this is an unreasonable request, nor is it one that I have just pulled out of my head, since I provided at least 2 examples. What we also see in Trinidad and Tobago, which I quite like, obviously we do not have to mock Trinidad and Tobago, is that in addition to explanatory notes that are provided at the beginning of, in particular, complex legislation, is that they provide these brief background notes as well on their website that all of us could refer to, and so could the public. This legislation is important. This legislation seeks to do things that are critical, but it should not seek to do it without us understanding it fully. And my concern has been, from the time we received it, how on earth I'm going to be able to understand this appropriately to make the kind of contribution that I would like to make, one that is supposed to serve the country. So with that, which is not specifically about the content of the legislation, because I believe that if I am understanding correctly, what the legislation seeks to do is quite laudable and seeks to bring improvements, Mr. President, but about the process of bringing such complex types of legislation when we want transparency, accountability, buy-in, appropriate scrutiny, and really for the country to be brought along with us while we do our work in this place. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hayes. Senator Maladu.
Thank you, Mr. President. As usual, my comments will be brief. I will limit them to 2 sections of the bill. First of all, I want to commend the government on this good piece of work. It is excellent that we are staying ahead, or if I could say, maybe in this case, catching up, but it needed to be caught up. So I'm very pleased that we're doing this. Air transportation into Barbados is critical to our economy, being an island, of course, but also being tourism island and many of the other things we're going to talk about. 2 sections that I want to make my comments on, Mr. President. Let me start with Section 32, Clause 1. I am very pleased to see in this legislation that we are going to make it absolutely clear that audited financial reports will be needed within 4 months. The only thing I would like to say, and I've spoken on this before in relation to other legislation, is what is the teeth? What happens when this is not done? Because we seem to quite often be very good at writing great legislation and thinking about it, but later on enforcing it is a different issue. And there is nothing in this bill that tells us what happens if they fail to meet this criteria that we have laid out in there. But I'm thanking for having it. So we will see audited financial reports within 4 months of the end of the fiscal year. The second section that I would like to speak to is section 16. But before I go there, yesterday I attended the Barbados Chamber of Commerce luncheon, of which our Prime Minister spoke at, and very informative speech from the Prime Minister and from other members of her team. And a challenge was put out to the private sector that we need growth. And we need 15% growth. And I think if my numbers were correct, if I saw what was on the screen correct, we're looking for nearly $1 billion in growth from the private sector. $2 billion in growth, apparently. Apparently I was in the wrong currency. 15% it was. And how are we going to do this? And a challenge was put out to the private sector to get this done. And I think we all know that we need to do this. If we're going to see growth in employment, growth in salaries, growth individually, we need to do it. Section 16, though, interestingly, I just want, you may say, well, what's irrelevant of section 16 of this legislation to growth? Growth, from the private sector point of view, often when we talk in government circles, is you can see some businesses that are successful because of government, and you see other sections, other businesses that are successful despite government. And the key to growth, in my opinion, Mr. President, at this point, is we need to focus very carefully on facilitation. And facilitation, part of facilitation is removing the friction to getting things done. And regulations often provide that friction. So let me finish off by now bringing the relevance to section 16. Section 16 of this legislation basically tells us that the Minister of Health is going to make sure that planes coming in and out of the island at our aerodrome don't spread infectious diseases. Interesting for me, though, that I travel a lot, and I don't know if that's a privilege or a burden, but when I travel to the United States, as many people here, as soon as you land and you get to the gate, you can't wait to get off. You don't know how long the immigration line is going to be, and everyone is waiting to see that door open. And as soon as that door opens, the first person is out through the door and you're gone. If you travel to Canada, the same thing happens. I travel to the United Kingdom. The same thing happens. All just can't wait to get off the airplane. Door opens, we go. I can go on and quote and take up a bunch of your time. The reality is everywhere I go, that's what happens, other than Barbados. Barbados, we all have experienced it. We sit there on the plane, and eventually we manage to get up, and then we wait and we see, you know, a person who comes up the stairs, and they come and they speak to the air hostess who provides some papers. They look at these papers, and over the years I've asked the question, who is that? It turns out that it's a health person that comes. But I still don't understand why it is that we do this in all of the things that we could do. People are anticipating getting off this plane quickly. Why is it that in other countries they're able to do this electronically or otherwise? And I raise this not for that particular instance, but to say that we must challenge everything that we do, every process that we have, to remove the friction from what it is that we are doing. Is there really a reason in 2022? What is it that person mounting those steps was going to do? Was it not filed electronically? So with those few words on it, I wanted to just tie it back to growth. I wanted to commend the government with getting this legislation done. It is very important. I'm very glad to hear that it's done in the speed at which it is done. I do agree with fellow senators, one, that the cost needed to be addressed, two, that it is quite a technical piece of legislation, and hence it would be helpful to know a bit more about it. But having said that, I commend you for doing it, and thank you for the time. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Senator Malaloux. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me say that I fully support this bill, and I also want to commend Senator Cummings on taking us through it and giving us a chance to understand, as has been mentioned time and time again, a lot of the technicalities of this particular bill. But one of the things that I want us to look at are what are the benefits of what we're doing. This is, in my mind, the very first steps of a wider program. Getting to this particular place is important. If you look back, and because I'm just going to look at two particular instances when we talk about the safety, because as mentioned by Senator Malalou and others, Barbados is known for its tourism. But there have been conversations in this country for a long time talking about the diversification of the economy and looking at other ways to have income streams and create jobs and all of these things. And although the civil aviation is what it is itself, it still is tied in many ways with tourism. And if we're talking about creating new jobs, we're talking about creating new skills, we're talking about Barbados being a hub for various things, and civil aviation being one in terms of the engagements that we are having with the continent of Africa, and having a prime minister who is on the world stage. There's a curiosity about this 166 square miles that people are interested in coming. So the prospects of a lot more visitors coming to the island are there. But you don't wait until people start coming to then realize that there are lots of things that you have to get in place to meet that. As the old people would say, what ain't reach you ain't pass you. And so in this legislation, I want to talk a little bit about the safety aspects of it. We had an unfortunate incident, I remember it clearly as a youngster, in the 70s, and there's the monument on the West Coast to that unfortunate incident with Cubana Airlines. Imagine if we, at that time, were different. If we had better security, if we had a whole set of other things in place, maybe that could have been avoided, who knows? But in the world that we live in today, we've seen people go on planes trying to light the shoes. We've seen planes crash into buildings. We have all of these things that are going on around us. Safety has to be paramount, especially if you're depending on tourism. You have to be there. Now, when I first heard about us not being able to pass certain standards, international standards, I thought to myself, but we're really almost like playing Russian roulette. Now, just think about it. If some unfortunate incident had to happen in Barbados, now or in the near future, think about the devastation that will wreak on us as an economy in this environment already. This is not a joke. This is not, I understand when people ask questions about certain things. You know, I understand it. You ask about how much is this going to cost? I prefer to look at it, what is it going to cost if you don't get it right? Not what's going to cost me in money up front, but what is it going to cost us if we don't get it right? That is the question that we should be asking ourselves, especially in the environment that we are in. And so for me, it is really, really important that for persons on the outside of these chambers, especially where you have call-in programs, and as was mentioned earlier, you have a lot of armchair experts who obviously, and on social media, everybody wants to be a star nowadays. Everybody has the opportunity to put an opinion out there, which is fine, but sometimes they are so misleading. They are so misleading that you find this entire 166 square miles now caught in a web of fear. People are afraid to do, they're afraid not to do. It is almost like we're in this frozen. Because if you do something, then someone can easily come and say, but this is this, without having all the facts. And you start to create all sorts of fear within the society. Now, a simple conundrum is this. Often I hear people complaining about the civil service. Oh, the civil service is this, the civil service is the next, and we can't do this, and we got to do this. And I tie this back to this particular thing where we are questioning now, again, how much it can cost. But if you said that you were going to privatize it, you have the same problem. And in the world that I live in, the one thing that I know is that the worst thing anybody could do is to do absolutely nothing. You have to do something. Even if you make a mistake, you learn from it, but you have to do something. If you do nothing, you stay where you are. And so it is important that we get on board with these kinds of initiatives. As was mentioned earlier, it's not one of those sexy things that everybody can jump up and shout and put their hands up in the air about. But it has very positive implications for our people. This will create new jobs, if you get it right. You create new skills. If you're talking about becoming a hub for mechanics and other things, then you have to start thinking, okay, if you become a mechanics hub and you have these more skillful persons and things, and then you have, as was mentioned earlier, the opportunity to train commercial pilots, and these, what are the other things that this is going to spin off from having those things here? And it's like circles that keep going and get wider and wider. And there become more opportunities for persons to benefit from it. So it is important that while we seek perfection in everything that we do, I think sometimes we have to pause and look at the wider picture and to see how do we get there as fast as we can, understanding, as I've said before, the world that we live in, how do we get there as fast as we can? And when I listen to Senator Cummings speak about moving this from 1.5 years to 9 months, with the same civil service that everybody's be quarreling about, I think it is a reason for us to commend these persons for getting us to this particular point so quickly. There is, yes, a lot more to be done, but like I said, I see this legislation as the first steps in this journey. And I just want to say that as we go forward, I am sure that there are things that probably we haven't seen before that may raise their heads, as it always does in life. You will always find that something has happened. But the reality is that Barbados has never been in the forefront of innovation, science, technology, nothing like that, no of the time. In fact, in my recollection, the one thing that we've been in the forefront of is development is rum. Nothing else that I can think of that you can say that we've been in the forefront of it, which means you have to be playing catch up all the time as the technology changes, as the laws surrounding travel change. You're always going to be playing catch up. And we are playing catch up here, and we are playing catch up in a serious way in not being able to make 80% of what is necessary to have us in a category that people will feel safe coming to this country. You think about it. When we talk about Barbados becoming a global player or a place of excellence, well then, you know, it was interesting that Senator Cummings didn't say what we actually scored. I believe that it would have been so low that she would not want to embarrass us even further. But it is important that we get, but I understand, Senator, because if I were in your place, I wouldn't want to say what that number was either. But the point is that if we are serious about the things that we profess from day to day, that we want Barbados to be this, that we want to be able to, be seen as this, then you've got to do the things that you need to do at every step in order to get there. And this, for me, is one piece of that particular puzzle, but at least the first steps. And so, Mr. President, I thank you for acknowledging me and giving me the opportunity just to make those few words. I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that we do now suspend deliberations for lunch for a period of 1 hour to reconvene the sitting at 2:40 p.m.
The question is that the sitting be suspended until 2:40 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. The sitting stands suspended until 2:40 p.m.